UKRI, which runs the GCRF program, and the Challenge Leader Food Systems portfolio. I'm also a professor of nutritional sciences at University of Central Lancashire, and I do research in biofortification and Livestock.
Grace Akendo from Uganda. I am a researcher, but I'm interested in what happens during a humanitarian crisis. I'm also a reviewer for the UKRI and grant applications.
I'm Richa. I'm a PhD scholar in NIL and I'm working on food labels.
Good morning. I am Daniel Pusapon of the University of Ghana. I am an agricultural economist, but I'm also the Dean of the School of Agriculture at the University.
Hello everyone, my name is Lucas Pavera. I'm a PhD student from Czech University of Life Sciences, and I'm working in West Sumatra on project linking agrobiodiversity with nutrition of two ethnic groups.
Hello, I'm Dr. Kavita Menon. I represent Symbiosis International University. We have courses in public health nutrition, nutrigenomics, and clinical nutrition and dietetics, thinking in the line of food policy research studies. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jana Moniz Performer. I'm from Charles Darwin University. I'm a PhD student looking at food security, nutrition, and gender issues in Timor-Leste.
Hello, I'm Vasanthi Sirkuri from the National Institute of Nutrition. I work on food safety issues with a focus on mycotoxins.
Hello everybody, my name is Greg Cooper. I'm from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. I'm a postdoc research fellow studying the fruit and vegetable value chain in the northern state of Bihar in India.
Hi, I'm Erin Lentz. I'm from the University of Texas. I'm an assistant professor of public affairs, and I work on the Women's Empowerment and Nutrition Index.
Hello, I'm Rohini Mukherjee. I'm from Nandi Foundation. I live in Hyderabad. We have done two large surveys across India, one on nutrition and one on teenage girls.
Hi everyone, I'm an agriculture development economist with App Associates. Also the director of international evaluation research over there. All the budding PhD students, I do have a job opening.
Hi, my name is Hans Strong. I'm an MPH student at Northwestern University studying epidemiology, and I work on a participatory agroecology study in Tanzania, looking at how it affects food security, gender equity, and depression.
Hi, I'm Prithvi Alur from ASER. My work is now focused on maternal and infant and young child feeding and nutrition. That's about it.
Hello, I'm Johanna Wong. I am a research assistant with Chatham House on this project, so you'll hear from me shortly. And I'm also a PhD student at the University of Sydney, looking at diets, nutrition, and chickens in Timor-Leste.
Hello, my name is Hong Nguyen from International Livestock Research Institute, INRI, based in Vietnam. So I'm working on food safety and eco-health, and I will talk to you again very soon.
Hi, good morning. I am Maria Garza. I am a veterinarian also doing a PhD at the Royal Veterinary College on aquaculture systems and governance and the link with food safety.
Hi, I'm Karishma. I'm from ASA Center 2, and our work at Social Sector Unit ASA Center is focused on nutrition, health and hygiene programs for children, mothers, pregnant women, middle school children, and age is basically no barrier. So we're working on projects on nutrition, health and hygiene.
Hi, my name is Anna Herborg. I co-lead the community practice and work on metrics of food around affordability and diet and trying to link with policy.
Hi everyone, I'm Mia Blackstein. I'm a second year PhD student at Harvard School of Public Health. I work on safe food production and dietary diversity.
Hi, I'm Wendy Mulaga from Tanzania. I'm working with the Tanzania Veterinary Laboratory Registry and as a researcher in animal nutrition. and also I work also on another project which involve women, chicken, and looking at different aspects in these households on nutrition and health.
Hi, my name is Susila Gimire. I'm from Nepal and I work with World Health Welfare Germany, and I'm managing our food and nutrition security portfolio.
Hi, I'm Steve Thornhill from University College Cork in Ireland. I mainly work on trade policy, but I've been working on a project with Joyce Canabo in Tanzania on improving indicators for on nutrition for influence in food policy.
Hi, I'm Fran Harris and I'm a PhD student and research assistant at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, working on nutrition and specifically around issues of water security and food production in India. And I'm the last person, and I'm speaking later as well, so.
Thanks very much. There's a wealth of expertise in the room, so I hope it'll be a chance to share your knowledge. Our opening presentations are really just to set the scene. Clearly, what we're going to present is not necessarily going to be completely new to many of you. So the first session is divided into two parts. Johanna Hung and I are going to talk on a project that's focusing on livestock and aquaculture policy, and then Fran's going to talk about the Collaborate project, and we hope it's going to work seamlessly. For some of you, these images will be very familiar. Even in a rapidly urbanizing world, most of our food is still coming from small farmers. Huge numbers of farmers are operating off very small land areas. And they are responsible for managing agricultural land. So what farmers can do to manage their land effectively is going to depend on their income and their access to land tenure. If they don't have certainty of land tenure, if their farm gate prices are not adequate, their ability to manage that land is deeply compromised. Whether you like the $1.90 a day, whether you believe it's a useful figure or not, it's still the reality is that many small family farmers receive very low income, and governments often over the years have had policies to do that, to keep food prices low so that the noisy people in the cities are happy and the farmers that are just busy working and don't necessarily organise as well have to accept generally what prices they are given. Some countries will give floor prices, but even those floor prices are often insufficient compared to what a farmer would need to manage their land effectively. In terms of aquaculture, it's an amazing growth industry. There's huge investment in aquaculture, and a lot of what is happening in low and middle income countries. Why is that happening? We're not sure. We do know that in some high income countries, the operators say that because of regulations in place around food safety, environmental safety, means that they're not competitive in a global market. So there are questions to be asked there around those issues. But in terms of aquaculture, incredibly important for many families in a range of value chains and at the household level, also a very important form of both direct and indirect income and food security for women. But as we move towards certification and requiring certain standards, the pressure on these small producers is becoming more abundant and challenging, meaning that often you're going to have a push towards aggregation and larger companies or cooperatives that manage across a value chain. This is a very brief introduction to our project with the Gates Foundation. Chatham House has simply been asked to develop a decision tool to help them think about their investments within their livestock initiative. And it's going to be about looking at trade-offs and options across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And what they want to look is at something that's not only going to give an income to smallholders, and what we know is that in many parts of the world, smallholder incomes at the farm level have not improved, but we also want to have environmentally sustainable and socially acceptable production options. And to do that through a nutrition and gender sensitive lens. It's an impossible combination, isn't it? But it's nice to dream. We've been busy, Johanna in particular has been busy doing literature reviews, forming a peer review group. We've had a public call for contributions. Our case study countries are Bangladesh and Nigeria, but we're certainly looking at examples, good and bad, of policy successes and policy challenges across those two regions. We'll be having a roundtable in each country to work through what we've found and to ground truth the decision tool as we've developed it together with the checklist. We have a very broad definition of policy. Once again, makes our job harder, but it's the reality, particularly in cases, in situations where government policy is not necessarily implemented. There will be other policies that are having an effect within the market system. We're looking, as we mentioned, to meet development objectives, but as well as economic. These are clearly the 4 SDGs that immediately jump out at you, but we recognise that there are many others that are involved in meeting the objectives. However, before we move forward, what we thought is that we'd like to just get a feel for what you're thinking. So we know globally, particularly in high-income countries, there's a discussion about livestock, there's a discussion about aquaculture. So what we'd like to do is just ask you to think about, when we're dealing with the complexity and uncertainty of meeting the need for food production in a rapidly warming world, what do you think about when you heard that we're going to talk about livestock and aquaculture? So what we'd quickly like you to do is just to divide into 2 groups. So this means you get a little bit of exercise. So the first group that's going to be here at the front, when you thought of livestock and aquaculture, the first thing that came to mind is that you think we need to reduce the production of livestock and or aquaculture. But if what came to your mind was closer to the second option, we'll ask you to go to the back, and it's about that you thought that we need to improve the efficiency of production and of use of these 2 products. And then what we'd like you to do in your groups, very rapid fire, in 5 minutes, just think about the 3, your top priority for policy issues relating to those 2 topics. Is that okay? Okay, group 1, group 2, you have 5 minutes, you can do a standing round. So once again, you'll need to appoint somebody who's going to present your 3 policies at the end of the 5 minutes.
Producers, kind of managing, we get to the trade-offs too much, but managing the trade-offs, particular regulations and so on. So not a kind of uniform reduction, but there'll be certain parts of the system where we could target, whether that's globally or nationally. We then thought about reducing the support for livestock production within developed countries, whether that be kind of government subsidies or trade or whatever, but redirecting that towards developing countries. So kind of reducing kind of the power of the big producers in places like the UK and the US and so And then also within those countries, reducing, so whilst we're reducing subsidies for the big producers and perhaps kind of redirecting it kind of globally, also for maybe redirecting it towards kind of horticulture or less environmentally damaging forms of agriculture within the countries, within the developed countries themselves. But then we also realised there would have to be like a behaviour change, perhaps at the consumer end of the value chain. Higher awareness of meat-free or livestock-free diets. So those were our 3 ideas. We got there.
Excellent work in a tiny space.
It's fun that they picked the person with social speaking anxiety to we had a really interesting discussion. We spent most of the time talking about kind of the challenges, and so I'll try to summarize that into semi-policies, although we didn't get that far. So we talked about a lot about reducing food waste as one potential policy where you can really improve the efficiency of the food system without kind of going against limited environmental resources. So that would be maybe one top policy. But we also talked about how in a lot of contexts like India and Vietnam, there's very limited area for livestock or general agricultural production. And so we talked about kind of improving the efficiency without becoming the US with kind of factory farming, really large scale animal abuse that's economically efficient but isn't incorporating ethical and humanitarian considerations. And so we talked about how we need to really think about how we define efficiency and whether it's just a purely economic efficiency or more holistically. And so looking at the notes from our conversation, maybe policies to support that could be in India, there's a need for someone to look after your livestock, like that's really missing. And also the livestock feed is becoming more of a fast food type of chain. And so kind of looking at what we're feeding our livestock animals and how to make that kind of maybe using it as a comparative advantage opportunity where you're focusing on increasing the efficiency of organic and like ethical food and marketing that to increase the value of the production. And that was my best effort to summarize a really great conversation.
I came across this really helpful way of sort of presenting our world. And it is that if you consider an A4 sheet of paper as our world, and you then think about a business card, 1/3 of a business card is used for crop production across the world. 2/3 of that business card is associated with livestock production. So when we've got huge pressures, we're actually using a small component of the world. And we've just had the discussion about whether this balance needs to change in how we use our available resources. But one of the difficulties we need to deal with is that we are working across multiple planetary boundaries. So as we talk, and I know a lot of you were thinking about the Eat Lancet report, which placed a heavy emphasis on greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, as we deal with agriculture, we're dealing with increasing human population, but an increasingly urban human population and a problem of shortage of labour and skilled labour at a time when we really need people who know what they're doing and being committed to farming. They're moving to rural areas because they can't get a guaranteed adequate livelihood where they are. In terms of greenhouse gas emission, there's been a lot written. Some of that data has been revised. The difficulty is that greenhouse gas emission is going to vary depending on the production system, depending on the time of year, because it's what the animal eats that's going to make a huge difference to the amount of greenhouse gas emission.
Another issue that we don't often talk about, but it's soil. So in terms of terrestrial production, our soil, our topsoil, is our most important resource. 2.5 millimeters of soil takes 1,000 years to be produced. Unfortunately, with our industrial approaches to agriculture, soil erosion in areas where farmers do not have guaranteed land tenure, the tragedy of the commons, as people like to talk about, soil erosion is a huge issue. And if we can't do something about that, we cannot guarantee land-based production of either crops or animals. Our global food systems work with a tiny spectrum of both plants and animals, and yet there is so much diversity. And we know as we look beyond those typical plants and animals in our production system, the more indigenous or non-cultivated plants tend to have much better nutrient profiles because they haven't had that selection pressure to grow quickly. And a plant that grows quickly, you don't get uniform deposition of nutrients. So maize that grows more quickly will have more energy and a poorer nutrient density profile. The land tenure is a major issue. If you're going to maintain and take the risk of managing your land soundly, you need to know you're always going to have access to that land. If that can't be guaranteed, then it's a huge risk for you to invest in improving your land. How many people here have heard of regenerative agriculture? Some of you. How about agroecology? Okay, so agroecology I think is becoming very popular in Europe, and I think that makes sense because the European landscape is so altered. There's nothing natural about Europe. It's a completely man-made environment in many places. Even the natural areas have regrown post-war, post-conflict, whatever. I have to say in countries like Australia, regenerative agriculture resonates better with farmers. And what it means is overcoming the years of misuse of land. So really agriculture is like mining. It's an extractive industry. We're taking nutrients out of the soil as we take those plants we take the animals that eat those plants away. And we haven't necessarily been replacing to get the same profile that used to be there. For instance, in Australia, soil organic carbon content is now 50% what it was when the English washed up on our shores. So we have a lot to learn. We also have we have a lot to learn. I'm not going to provide any answers, but what I am going to do is encourage you to read. I think the thing is we don't know yet what's the best way forward, and it may be that there will be different approaches that are appropriate in different places. We'll share these slides with you, so when you have time, I would encourage you to just follow this link. So we know there's money in agriculture, huge money. So there's now huge arguments between, for instance, Impossible Foods, who are producing meat alternatives, with the Savory Institute, which is a group that uses holistic or promotes holistic resource management. And so what they're saying, the discussion is around thinking, if we're going to go with monoculture production of soybean, with potential for huge soil erosion, depending on the soybean production, it can really cause great lessening of diversity at soil level, soil that is almost sterile in some cases. Compared to using regenerative practices where you have groups of ruminants that move across grassland and are part of that natural system of getting the manure back into the soil to increase the diversity. So just for you to think about that. I also won't spend too long on this slide. If we look at the right-hand side, this is a lot of the industrial practices have focused on using inorganic fertilizers and promoting varieties and breeds that grow quickly. In terms of chemical fertilizer application, you have environmental implications associated with how it's produced. You have problems in terms of leaching of nitrogen that goes into water sources and eutrophication. It's maybe not such a problem across the low-income countries, but in high-income countries, this is a major issue, and it's causing huge environmental concerns with that runoff of nitrogen and getting increased nitrogen deposition into the soil. If you think about a more natural system, where I would think in this part of the world for centuries, people have grown rice or have grown crops, and then after that, the animals come in, they eat the stubble, the manure goes back into the soil as an organic fertilizer, and you get carbon sequestration. So some of the data is suggesting now that in terms of carbon sequestration, a regenerative livestock production can actually give you a net reduction in greenhouse gas emission. It's going to depend on what the figures were in doing those life cycle analyses. So I'm just going to suggest that you go and read the literature. There are no easy answers. And as this group here was saying, that targeted reduction in efficiency, it depends on what sort of efficiency you're looking for. So it's a difficult, certainly a difficult way forward with the way markets currently work. So, having that very rapid and less than satisfactory introduction to the topic, I'm going to hand over to Johanna to talk about decision trees.
Thanks, Robin. I also get anxious talking in public, so you're not the only one. If I'm going too quickly, please tell me and I'll try and slow down. But I think the discussion, so Robin's presentation and the discussions between the two groups lead quite nicely into the examples that I'm going to give. And I think most of you know what a decision tree is. It's obviously not this. It's a decision support tool that looks like a tree. And what it does is it visually represents all your different options. And it lets you compare across the board what are the results between those options if you should choose one. And it's typically, it's used a lot in economics and business where they quantitatively decide between options. So very simple example, if you had a sum of money and you wanted to invest it and you want to compare two different banks, in each of those banks you have an option of two different account types, and they give you different interest rates, and you can calculate over a period of time what sort of sum of money you'll end up at the end. And between those four options, you can pick the one that works best for you, for your goals. So you can use that in a quantitative fashion where you assign values to each of those and you calculate the end result. But another way of using it is qualitatively to work through a problem and think about possible solutions and to try and work through what trade-offs might come into the equation as well. And when we're talking about efficiency or how we think about efficiency, this is an example that we've come up with. So in terms of, we're talking about animal source food, so products from livestock or from aquaculture, and how we value that animal source food can change. So in the current situation, so business as usual, farmers are paid based on yield. So usually a set price per kilogram of product. So whether that's dressed carcass weight or whether that's the number of animals, kilograms of fish caught, this is what our economic system currently values. What that means is that production systems that favor high feed conversion ratios. So being able to feed the minimum amount of food, get the maximum amount of product is useful in this system. We also want animals that grow uniformly. So we want all the animals to reach a certain weight or a certain standard in the same amount of time so that it's easy to predict when they're going to go to market. We also want highly controlled environments. So we don't want too much instability in the system. We don't want too many changes. And so that might be controlling temperature or controlling feed or controlling the actual environments of sanitation or cleanliness. And all of these things lead to intensive production systems that fit those qualities. So this is not just in high-income countries where we see really intensive animal production. It's also being promoted in low and middle-income countries to be able to improve production system based on an economic valuing of based on yield. So linking back in with Robin's talk, some of the trade-offs that come from valuing animal source food like this is that you compromise other traits. So when you have a natural population of animals, you have genetic variety, and within that you have traits that might increase the immunity or the disease resistance of animals. When you select for growth, you actually compromise on some of those other traits. And so you end up with a uniform population of animals genetically, but also that are all susceptible at the same time to the same diseases. And some of those diseases are transmittable to humans, such as avian influenza. You also have a large number of animals in a small amount of space, and so you're compromising on animal welfare. And then again, intense concentrations of animals produce intense concentrations of waste. And so you need to be able to manage that waste. And the waste may not go back to the source where nutrients came from. So you're disrupting that nutrient cycle. Animals that grow quickly and that are selected for just growth, they don't have the time to concentrate nutrients in their body. They don't have access to a variety of nutrients within the environment, only what they're given. And this decreases their nutrient density. And lastly, in terms of gender, when you have large numbers of animals, intense production, commercial production, this is generally the area of men. So you don't find many women in these environments, and so you're excluding, half of the population. But when we think about potentially other ways that we could value animal source food, so pricing policies that are based on nutrient content, for example, what we might see is that production systems that favor smaller species or slower growing species are favored, and these tend to be the species with higher nutrient density. We will find fewer numbers of animals produced, so farmers are concentrating on raising these animals more slowly. They'll probably have to reduce their numbers. And if nutrients are valued, then potentially more of the carcass is used. So at the moment, when we are pricing animal source food based on yield, a lot of the offal or the nutrient-rich products are removed from the human food system. If we're valuing nutrients, those components of the carcass are really rich, and so they might actually feature more highly, and you might reduce the amount of waste from production of animal source food. So there are always going to be trade-offs. So if you're producing fewer animals, then there's less to go around, and so the price of animal source food might go up, even though what you're buying will be more nutrient dense. And if this policy is not taken up across the board, then markets that still value based on yield will punish those farmers for having lower production. And then another possible scenario is, what if we paid farmers based on their products, but also based on the services that they provide to the environment. So if we actually gave them money to look after the land and to practice animal production in ways that is more environmentally friendly, what might we see? We might see production systems that are mixed, so maybe mixed crop and animal systems where you can get nutrient cycling from animal waste going back into the soil, maybe going into your crops, maybe have mixtures of animals within that system. You're likely to have lower stocking densities because you don't want your animals to be kind of pillaging the land. You'd have greater uncertainty in that environment. So you probably would like animals that have differences in disease resistance or hardiness or temperature tolerance. And so you might actually prefer to have a mixture of animals there. And you might enrich the entire environment. So by not having these destructive practices, you might actually allow the land to regenerate, including the soil, including water health, and that will actually benefit the entire ecosystem. So you might have regeneration of native species, both in plants and animals, which increases the long-term sustainability. Again, the trade-offs, if you're producing fewer animals, there are fewer to go around. And in these kind of systems, potentially if you have a flourishing of native species alongside your domesticated species, you might have greater interaction between the two, which can also increase the risk of disease. So no system is perfect, but the point of looking at it all together and brainstorming through one particular idea, looking at the different options, is that you can have on maybe a very big piece of paper all of the options there that you can weigh up. And so it's a tool that you could use in different ways, quantitatively or qualitatively, to weigh up different options. So I'm going to pass over to Hung now for a real life example. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonah. Good morning again. So my task is actually to show you a bit what we have been doing in Vietnam in the areas of research on animal source food. But just as an introduction, you see that when we talked about animal source food and food system, we have various levels of food security across the country we are working. So we have the country or areas where people face to have enough animal source food to eat. And some of the area we are okay in terms of quantity, and people pay more attention to the quality and the safety aspect. And the example I want to talk to you today is actually about our research at INRE and partners in Vietnam about the pork value chain and pork safety in the country, how to design research leading to intervention. In another word, try to influencing the policy in food safety. Vietnam is a large country, almost 100 million people now. We have a big population of pigs, about 30 million a year. And actually, pork constitute a very large percentage of animal source food diet in the country. It's about 60% of our pork eaten in the country. And like many other countries in developing world, also people are concerned about food safety. For example, a study showing that people are very much concerned about the food safety is even higher rank than education and healthcare. For example, in the country we have our food safety law. 10 years ago, past 10 years ago, efficient as 10 years ago, efficient 10 years ago. But the reinforcement of the law is quite limited at the moment. And also, we manage quite well in the export market. We export a lot of fish and shrimp to different market. But in the domestic market, we have some issue in managing food safety. Robin already showed the SDG and agriculture and livestock, etc. But in terms of contribution of food safety, you can see that it contributes directly to a few and to a less extent to another SDG. And also when you look at the reality on how it works, the pork value chain and food safety in Vietnam, you can see that for example, here, the context that slaughterhouse workers work, everything happening, most of the case that happen at the floor level. Okay, so it goes a lot of contamination and issues as we need to improve, and also the way how people transport the carcass to the market. The motorbike is very popular in the country, and how people trade and sell pork in different informal or wet market in the country. And actually, in terms of quantity, this context represents about 80% of our production and maybe 80 or 90% of pork trading in the country. So the former market in the supermarket sector are growing, but it's actually represent about 10 to 20%. So I think the issue is still very much to solve there. When we talked about decision tree, Joanna nicely show you the tree and how it is used in the banking system, how to make a decision in putting money in the bank in a quantitative way. But in food safety, we were thinking more on how to apply the decision tree aligned with the HACCP concept. For example, you see how to manage the hazards along the pork value chain. That's why, to be honest, we didn't do this from the beginning of the project. But when I was asked to talk about that, I reflected a bit and construct this thing. So you can see that you can start with the question: are there really hazards that cause a likelihood of disease in the context of Vietnam? And if it goes to yes, you will ask the question: so what are these pathogens or chemical contamination? By using different methods of assessment, like for example microbiology, risk assessment, leading to the question: do you really control these hazards along this value chain? And if so, you need to think how to involve different stakeholders. What are the available measures to control these hazards, leading to the reduction of the risk for the population? And if so, at the end, you can propose a set of interventions leading to a safer food in the country. So, maybe in the next minutes, I will ask you to reflect a little bit, help me a little bit to identify this important intervention, how, from the perspective, you can do in Vietnam. Of course, we have some from our research, but let's discuss together. So this, for example, is an example of a decision tree. We can think about that. So to do that, we asked a question and we conducted a study, and basically we are running a food safety risk assessment along the value chain, really from the production level. So that is actually typically smallholder production system, where we have a few pigs, up to 50 pigs, and medium scale we have 50 to 200. So this small scale production in Vietnam representing about 80% of our pig production. And you already saw how it worked in slaughterhouse, in the market, and afterwards it goes to the consumption level. And we sample along this value chain: feed, pork, slaughterhouse, and the market, in the floor, etc. So we run on this simulation things, and the bottom line is, in fact, the risk of having diseases caused by Salmonella contaminated pork in Vietnamese context is about 18% per year for the whole population. So the risk look quite high compared to different report we have at the moment at global level. And the chemical risk assessment, basically we sample feed and pork in the market, and we analyze the different heavy metals and residues of antibiotics and some banned chemicals. And surprisingly, the level was quite low, and the risk was actually minimum and much lower than the risk caused by Salmonella in pork. This is also one of the important findings of the study, and it's very, very much aligned with the current global discussion about food safety. That's the burden of foodborne disease is very much from the microbial contamination rather than chemical contamination. We try to estimate it, estimate also the economics burden of this foodborne disease, and the conclusion is, in fact, one case of foodborne disease in Vietnam, looking at different system of hospitalization, is about $100 per case. And with the risk assessment, you would know how many cases of foodborne disease caused by specific food commodity, and you can have the burden at the national level. So that information is quite important for policymakers to see in terms of economic loss about that. And for example, we run a simulation and to show that, for example, with the population of Vietnam at the moment, with the risk we have at the moment, and if you introduce some kind of intervention to reduce, hopefully, for example, about 20% of the burden of disease in the country, you can save kind of substantial amount of money at national level. Okay, so finally, before asking you some exercise work, we have the evidence, and if you want to achieve some impact at the large scale, so you need to work with policymakers at national levels. And actually, here's one of the examples. We collaborated with the World Bank to develop a comprehensive report of food safety in Vietnam, challenges and opportunities, to present it to the government. And from this report, the government nicely took up some of the recommendation, and they work with different donors, in particular the World Bank, to develop a large project of food safety to improve the safety of food in different cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh cities. It's ongoing, but actually the research result could be used and influence a bit the policy in the country. Okay, I have one last line, but before that, the bottom line of our study is, in fact, we show that in the smallholder pig production in Vietnam, we have a lot of contamination in terms of salmonella. Salmonella in the water, in the farm, on the floor, also in the slaughterhouse and in the market. The prevalence was about 40% of salmonella contamination. Where you come from, developed countries like the US, EU, this prevalence is about 1 to 3%. And in developing world, it's not surprising at all to see the salmonella contamination. It's about 30 to 40, even 50%. Okay, so that's the first fact. The second is, in fact, the risk caused by salmonella is about 18%, but we have the solution. We have the measure to reduce this risk by limiting the cross-contamination and reduce the contamination along the value chains. Okay, so my question for you is, in fact, in 3 minutes, and don't move, just talk with people around the table. Could you please advise how Vietnamese Ministry of Health and Ministry of Agriculture to develop some policy to help reduce the risk of food safety linked to pork value chains in Vietnam? Don't worry that is true or wrong or right. It's unrealistic or unrealistic, but 3 minutes. Based on my talk and my information, please help us to come up with some recommendation. And I need one person to one people per table to report back, to share in the idea. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Now we can stop discussion. Okay, so I just want to hear some ideas about you. It's not fair because Robin works a bit with us and she visited. So I would ask the group, for example, not Robin directly. So to tell us quickly, just 30 seconds, what do you want to do to help us to improve food safety in Vietnam?
I was very lucky to have experts with me, so they just gave me the answers. So I'm a social scientist, so this kind of information comes to me for the first time. So I was told we give them an alternative practice. Instead of slaughtering on the floor, tell them to hang the animal, and then the inside, the content falls down. So the animal remains clean, because the source of contamination is the internal parts. And then the other one, so that was mostly the intervention. But as a social scientist, I know about behavior. And behavior sometimes takes a long time to develop. If you get a 40-year-old and you want to train them new tricks, better be patient from the start, because they can tell you, oh, this is what we've been doing all our lives. This is what we've been doing all our lives. They tell you all the advantages of what they've been doing before. And sometimes they can adapt it. They can adapt your practice when you're there, and then after you leave, they find it tedious again. And then
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting you. I think that social science can go a little longer. But I get from you is hanging system in slaughterhouse and behavior change of different people along the value chain. Okay, let me move to here. Only one best option would you propose?
Anyone? We actually got 3. So we thought raising awareness of the level of contamination at the consumer end, whether it be through public kind of awareness campaigns, standards and labeling, and that would have to require kind of a more rigorous and frequent kind of monitoring and testing within the slaughterhouses and the farms and so on. So that would be maybe on more of kind of the regulation side. So raising awareness, standards and labeling, monitoring.
Thank you very much. So again, behavior change in particular for the consumer, that's and regulation.
We actually got the same. We just had 3: regulation, education, awareness, and the other one we got was government incentives to help the smaller producers and processors and all the smaller people involved throughout the chain to transition towards a more safe environment, because it's very difficult. Looking at the transport situation there of pork, how do you help those people that have got very good livelihoods at the moment doing that kind of thing move to a better system and safer system of distribution? So I think incentives are needed as well. But regulation was the first one we had, and the trade-off obviously is more costs. But looking at the costs that you're presenting there, I mean, they're pretty substantial. I mean, 18% of the population, it's an incredible figure. I never realized it would be so high.
Okay, thank you very much. So you have some similar recommendation, but I like very much so incentive measure issue, because that actually is the key for food safety intervention. Because in some of the case, some of the farmers, they have better production systems, a little bit more costly, but at the end, when it goes to the market, they sell with the same price as the pork produced by a less, a lower quality system. So they didn't have incentive to really promote the good practice. Okay, 2 remaining group, please tell us only what was not told before. You have a more innovative, better solution or different solutions than what we had before. Do you have anything?
Some of the people said that maybe the fact that there could be some better detection along the value chain, so that the people involved in handling the pork, for instance, they could be aware of the presence of the bacteria or the food hazards, and maybe that could act as well, knowing that is there. So detection at the different points of the value chain.
Yes, so this is about about the testing, and also it's a traceability issue. Okay, I am aware of the time, Robin, but I stop now. Do you have anything new?
Source of infection of salmonella, because that's a major infection. So probably more HACCP concept should be applied to identify where the contamination is coming from and put a better control.
Okay. Thank you very much. That is a good idea, but it's so also quite clearly that it's slaughterhouse level. Okay, so thank you very much for all this contribution. I will finish by showing what we have identified, and this is being done. So we have identified a few options of intervention. The first one is at farm level. I think that's applying the Viet good animal husbandry practices is one of the key things that we are doing. Even it's difficult to apply for the smallholder. Better biosecurity, better hygiene at the farm level. There are concern about antibiotic residues. Even we don't detect much about at the end of the pork value chain. We try to promote the reduction of the use of antibiotics by replacing by different options for example, probiotics. We are testing that. At the slaughterhouse level, you are perfectly right. The hanging system is the future. However, the change of the practice of the people, they don't want to use it. Many projects try to put the hanging system, but it's failed because people don't like it. So we try to introduce as the so-called light touch intervention. Instead of having the hanging system, we introduce the grid in metals about 30 centimeters from the floor to separate the carcass and the floor to reduce the contamination. It looks like that people accept it rather bringing pigs in the hanging system. In the market, we promote the branding to educate people that they pay more when the pork have a higher quality. But this is a package of intervention to promote the branding and also having better hygiene condition. And from the consumption point of view, like you said, you have a lot of education to really help people to reduce the cross-contamination, because people want to use a fresh pork, the hot pork, freshly slaughtered, and they use the same cutting board and knife when they cut fruit and vegetable, etc. And this is one of the major risk factors for the risk, to reduce the risk. And on top of that, we use kind of the nudge theory to promote people to act with different options that have identified. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And we put a few reference both from Robin, Joanna, and myself, if you want to have more reading on our talk. Thank you very much for your attention.